What do you think the prospect is of, and maybe this is something that illuminates that the shift or the issues with 60/40, moving ahead. Like, what do you think the prospect is of that we're in a higher inflationary period? I'm talking like multi decades, compared to what it's been, and that if the Fed cuts rates now, it's going to be kind of smaller because they're not going to be able to cut as much, and then we'll have that inflationary kind of rebound, and then that's where my head's at. I'm trying to figure out, like, all right, the Fed cuts now, and inflation's still higher than it has been in relatively recent history. Like, what happens next after that?
Well, I think the idea that we're going to be in a higher inflationary environment ahead seems pretty compelling to me than the last 20 or 30 years. What I'd first emphasize is if you're holding 60/40, the portfolio you're holding is essentially in a position that is hugely underweight higher inflationary dynamics. So just start off at 60/40. It's basically saying there will be secular disinflation and strong growth happening for the next 30 years, just as it has for the last 30 years. And so even if you were just to get to neutral, meaning like you were balanced to the possibility that we might have higher inflation or not in the next 20 the next 10, 20, 30 years, that would mean getting away from the 60/40 portfolio as your baseline. And I think there's probably compelling reasons why it probably is higher than average. That probability is higher than average because of the dynamics that we've seen. Like basically we had globalization and no conflict over the course of 20 or 30 years. Like if you look at the conflict side of things, we basically had through 2000 through 2020, we had the lowest number of deaths in global conflicts per capita as we'd had basically in 1500 years in the global economy. Now, am I predicting that it will necessarily go up? I'm not necessarily predicting that it'll go up, but it has risen. And I wouldn't necessarily assume that we would fall back to that trajectory. I was just reading the Financial Times today, and it's like a war in Ukraine, a war in Gaza, a war in Mali. Like how many? It's like war, 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 and that is important because wars are inflationary. No matter how you look at it, wars are inflationary, whether you think they're just wars or unjust wars or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's definitely inflationary because it involves creating stuff and destroying it, and also destroying the infrastructure that exists there and then having to rebuild it again. And so I think that part of things is really, tilts. The probabilities are tilted towards more conflict ahead, and certainly the momentum is in that direction. And then in terms of globalization, we're clearly past peak globalization. The geopolitical circumstance is, folks are pulling apart. Whether, say, a Trump administration gets elected and pursues a tariff policy, or they don't get elected and, the existing administration, pursues other ways in which efforts are made to put up trade barriers, one form or another, trade barriers, capital barriers, geopolitical integration is definitely going to be lower in the future than it has been in the past. And so that also is inflationary because it means you have to duplicate supply chains and duplicate infrastructure versus just using the lowest cost producer globally.